Enjoyed your lunch. Before we begin our afternoon session, Chancellor Castro has a few words for us.
Thank you, Chair Kimbell. Well, again, I want to thank you all for being here today. I have a very special announcement, some good news. We've learned that Governor Newsom will be informing the legislature today that he wishes to amend his January budget proposal, and that within that amended budget proposal for CSU, he would be restoring the entire $299 million cut. This would be in addition to the $145 million increase that he called for in the January budget. And if my math is correct, that's about $444 million in permanent funding. And if that wasn't good enough news, he also is going to add another $1.3 million to support administrative costs and outreach associated with our CSU's efforts around enrolling more students in the CalFresh program. So very important development today. I want to thank all of you for your continued advocacy. I want to thank Governor Newsom, who's been heroic in his actions, and the legislative leaders and all members of the legislature who are listening to our one unified message. The CSU is prepared to do more during this consequential time. So I wanted to share that positive news with you, and you'll be hearing more about it, I'm sure, in the press. And we must keep our advocacy going strong. We cannot stop. We need to keep it going. And I appreciate all of your efforts, and I'll turn it back to Chair Kimbell.
Well, thank you for that. Much needed, welcome, wonderful news. And thank you for everything you're doing on that end with the advocacy. Anyway, so welcome back, everyone. For our afternoon session, we will hear an overview of the CSU budget, tuition, fees, and financial aid from Steve Relia, Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer, and Dr. Lauren Blanchard, Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs. Steve, please begin.
Thank you, Chair Kimbell. So and let me make sure Ryan is actually running the presentation. So there we have the first slide. Chancellor Castro, I could really get used to that kind of introduction for all of my budget presentations. So thank you very much. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you with an overview of a number of interrelated topics. Budget, tuition, fees, and financial aid, they're all components of the resources that serve our institution. So keeping in mind with the advice shared by Trustee Emerita Achtenberg this morning, we're providing you with key information about each of these topics so that it will help your understanding of them, and also provides some background so you could provide us guidance and leadership in your role as a board member. So next slide, please. Let's see, there it is. So here's the agenda for this afternoon session. We'll start with a budget overview that covers our principal funding sources, namely state general funds, tuition, and fees. Then we'll have a discussion about the ways that the CSU handles Category 2 campus-based fees, and that is the consultation and referendum processes. After that, we'll provide information on financial trends of the university and outline some particular insights on those trends. And then finally, Executive Vice Chancellor Blanchard and Nathan Evans will review student financial aid at the California State University and how it benefits our students. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Assistant Vice Chancellor Ryan Storm. Ryan?
Thank you, Steve. So we'll start with the budget overview here. So let's take a look at some high-level information on the CSU budget. So this pie chart is a depiction of the CSU's total revenue of $12 billion collected last year. This information is available on CSU's Financial Transparency Portal website. The yellow section represents designated and other enterprise activities of the university, such as student housing, parking, professional and continuing education, and student centers. As you can see, about 1/3 of our total budget is restricted for specific purposes as directed by state statute. In other words, we cannot use designated funds for operating budget purposes. Now, the large green section represents the operating fund, which supports the core functions of the university. Now, the next two slides will drill down further into the details of that operating fund budget for the current year, 2020-21. Now, the operating budget represents the core functions of the university, such as classroom instruction, student services, campus operations, and the state university grant. At nearly every board meeting, there is an information or an action item on the operating budget. And it is fairly straightforward why that is the case. The operating fund has three primary funding sources that are significantly important to CSU stakeholders. They are tuition revenue at 36%, state general fund appropriation at 55%, and 9% from campus-based fees and other revenue sources. Now, this pie chart shows the operating budget displayed by high-level expense category. Salaries and benefits, shown in green, make up about 74% of the total operating budget. Financial aid, shown in purple, makes up 11% and represents the state university grant program. The remaining 15% in yellow is made up of a variety of expenses, such as instructional equipment, supplies, contracts, utilities, and any other non-personnel expenditure of the university. And overall, the operating budget is $6.9 billion today. Based on what we heard from Chancellor Castro, it's looking like next year's will be a lot higher. So that's good news. So it has been said that the CSU is the people's university. Well, this slide puts a different light on that title because the operating fund is dedicated to people in the form of employee salaries and wages, benefits, and in the form of student financial aid. Now, this slide summarizes current tuition and fee rates for our three main categories: undergraduate, post-baccalaureate, and non-resident. Tuition is set by the Board of Trustees as governed by the board in the board's student fee policy. All students enrolled at a CSU campus are assessed tuition that is paid by the student, their families, or paid for by taxpayers through federal, state, or institutional financial aid programs. Now, undergraduate tuition is $5,742 per year. As noted, that rate increased by $270 in 2017-18, which was the only time in the last decade. We have unique tuition rates for post-baccalaureate programs, and they are on the screen. All non-resident students are assessed a supplemental fee. This is in addition to tuition. It's technically charged on a per unit rate, but for illustration purposes, a full-time non-resident undergraduate student is charged an additional $11,880 per year. Now, beginning in 2019, San Luis Obispo implemented a campus mandatory fee pilot program, which charges non-resident students an additional fee. Revenue from these fees provides support services to SLO's low-income students. Now, the campus is scheduled to perform a comprehensive evaluation of that pilot program before the 2023 academic year begins. Now, we point out this pilot program because there has been interest by the board in considering market rate non-resident tuition changes. Our advice to you is to first learn from the pilot program evaluation, then consider what to do next on non-resident tuition. You will recall from our fee report at the January meeting The CSU student fee policy authorizes 6 fee categories. Here we have briefly summarized each of those categories, including who has authority over those fees. Tuition and system-wide fees are category 1. The board governs these fees. Examples are tuition and the application fee. Campus-based mandatory fees are category 2. We will skip these details for now because we have several slides on these next. Miscellaneous course fees are category 3 and governed by the campus president. Examples are specialized laboratory fees and course field trips. Now, state support, administrative fees and fines are category 4. These are also governed by presidents. Examples are library fines and transcript fees. And then we also have self-support administrative fees and fines. These are category 5. Again, they are governed by presidents. And examples are parking, housing, and professional continuing education. Voluntary fees are category 6, and these are, again, governed by the Board of Trustees. And the only example we have here is the student involvement and representation fee. Now, this chart is a recap of our category 2 campus-based mandatory fee rates for the current academic year. We share this information during the January board meeting as well. We counted them up, and there are 145 category 2 fees on our campuses. Rates vary because of service levels, program opportunities, and facilities. Additionally, some fees are adjusted for inflation and others are not. Now, there has been some recent interest in having the board, not the campus presidents, responsible for adjusting category 2 fees. With 145 of those fees, one factor to consider is the volume of detailed administrative work the board would have to undertake. Now, the Chancellor's Office strongly recommends that the current process remains. The campus president is in the best position to balance instruction and student supports and the funding necessary to deliver the most appropriate student experience. Further, so keep the board focused on policy considerations of the university, not at administrative and ministerial tasks. Next, I will proceed to talking about how fees are created and adjusted. Now, the CSU fee policy authorizes the creation and adjustment of category 2 campus-based mandatory fees through the consultation or the referendum processes. Just as each campus has individual fee rates, program opportunities, and facility needs, there are varying reasons and approaches each campus president considers when evaluating changes to their mandatory fees. The next few slides will provide an overview of each process and some key differences. First, let's define a few terms. Boiling it down to a simple definition, consultation is a discussion about a fee proposal that includes input from the student body and various groups. Now, a referendum is a vote to measure student support of a fee proposal. It is often held concurrent with the annual student election cycle. Now, each campus has a fee advisory committee who provides advice and recommendations to the president regarding student fees. The official name of the governance structure of the fee advisory committee can vary slightly across campuses, but generally, this is how they are structured. We have student members who are the majority on this committee and are appointed by the campus student body association and include the campus student body president. Faculty members are appointed consistent with the normal campus processes and include the faculty senate chair. And the president of the campus appoints other members to the committee, but not students. Finally, the president appoints the chair of the committee. Now, this slide compares the consultation and the referendum processes. Student participation is more comprehensive in the consultation process. Students are involved in focus groups and forums. Students are invited to participate in surveys. And there are many ways students are contacted about proposed fee changes. Also, student participation is limited in the referendum process through just a simple vote. Now, the fee advisory committee I mentioned is more involved in the consultation process. The committee consults with the president about the proposed changes, develops consultation strategies for students and employees, develops written materials about the proposal, and reviews results of the consultation. Also, that committee makes a recommendation to the president on next steps. Now, under the referendum process, the committee develops the voter pamphlet as well as reviews the vote results and makes a recommendation to the president. So in sum, the fee advisory committee is more involved in the consultation process than in the referendum process. Now, consultation is better choice in some other ways. There's enhanced interaction with in-person feedback. There are multiple venues, dates, and times that foster increased participation. And feedback is not limited just to students, but to staff and faculty. And experience shows that there is more potential to reach more students in consultation than in referendum. As far as a result, the referendum is binding for 3 types of fees: student body, student union, and student success fees. For all other fees, both consultation and referendum are advisory to the president, who has the authority to adjust fees, or if a brand new fee, is the person to recommend the creation of the new fee to the chancellor. Now, overall, the consultation process is more informative to the president, who is responsible for creating or adjusting the fee. Fee proposals can be technical and they can be complex, and this process can better unpack the breadth of proposed student services and financial support and financial impact on students. It also helps the president understand from students in various groups why there is opposition or support for a fee. While a referendum is a good exercise in democracy, it is simply a yes or no vote, and there is no explanation from voters why they voted the way they did. Referendum voter turnout is usually low, sometimes as low as single digits, and our experience is that there is usually less student engagement in the referendum process than in the consultation process. All right, well, that ends our discussion about the budget, tuition, and fees, and now we'll move to next group of slides. And these provide some historical context on the CSU financial trends. So this chart shows inflation-adjusted state general fund and tuition over time. The steady decline in state allocations to the CSU, you see that in blue there, that's the general fund. It hit a low point in 2011, 2012 during the Great Recession. Now the orange line shows the steady increase in tuition revenue. These are all inflation adjusted. It spans the same time period, reaching a high point in 2011, 2012. Now, the general fund reductions were a result of 10 years of economic uncertainty, and they triggered steep tuition increases. You can see that in 2011-12, tuition revenue surpassed general fund in the operating budget for the first time in our history. As we show the rest of the trend here again, the 2 lines have crossed back with continued general fund increases in recent years and tuition and flat tuition for most years. Now this chart shows how changes in state general fund support, this chart shows how changes in state general fund support affect the state support of the university. To orient you, the horizontal line is 0. Numbers above this line are budget increases, and those below the line are budget reductions. We start with the green line that shows the incremental change to the CSU's general fund allocation from the state. For comparison, we want to show you the incremental change to the state's general fund budget in blue. That blue line, graphed on the z-axis, on the right-hand side shows a similar pattern that mimics the university's fortunes. So the general message here is that as the state's fortunes have increased, CSU funding has increased. But as the state's budget situation soured, so did the CSU state funding picture. All right, now this slide will show us how they will show us the proportional share of total funding for a few parts of the state budget over the last 40 years. This first line is the annual kindergarten through 12th grade general fund allocation as a percent of the total general fund budget. This is primarily affected by what you may have heard of as Proposition 98. It's a particular earmark that's required by the Constitution, and it's been in place since the late 1980s. Now, this blue line shows you the share of funding dedicated to higher education. This includes the CSU, the University of California, community colleges, and the Student Aid Commission. The community colleges are also funded through that Proposition 98 funding guarantee as well. Now, this yellow line shows the increases in funding dedicated for the Department of Corrections, reflecting legal and policy changes over the years and the impact of collective bargaining agreements in that sector. And lastly, in green at the bottom, we've broken out the CSU from the higher education line. This is our annual general fund allocation. It shows a gradual decline over a 30-year period from the mid-1970s through the mid-2000s, and a relatively flat share of the state's general fund for the last 15 years. All right, this chart walks through the budget cycle process from the CSU budget request to the governor's initial budget proposal each January to the final budget act adopted for the new fiscal year. So again, the middle line is 0. Numbers above the line are budget increases, and those below the line are budget reductions. Starting with this orange line, the CSU request approved by the Board of Trustees each November has always been a request of CSU budget priorities and needs, regardless of the state's economic condition. Now, this blue line shows the amounts proposed for the CSU in the governor's annual January budget proposal. This line obviously reflects the governor's funding priorities for the university, but it also serves as a good gauge on the state's fiscal outlook and how the university fits into that overall picture. The green line, the final budget act, is the best indicator of financial condition of the state and how much of a priority the CSU is to the governor and the legislature. So please note how closely related the green and blue lines are. While they do not always align the proposed funding level by the governor in January to the final budget act each year, it's generally a very good indicator of what the funding level will be for the CSU at the final budget act. So kind of what it's showing is that the governor's proposal is oftentimes pretty closely to where the final budget act lands. So there are some interesting points or interesting items to point out here. The early part of the chart shows a compact type agreement for general fund increases and accompanying tuition increases over a period of years under Governor Schwarzenegger's administration. In 2006-07, the CSU requested the general fund amount that was part of the multi-year agreement, including a tuition increase. But that year, the governor's January budget proposed to buy out a portion of that tuition increase, and the final budget did just that. In 2009-10, federal funds supplemented state budgets as a part of the federal stimulus during the Great Recession. This allowed the CSU to help smooth out the impact of the $1 billion cut that culminated in 2011-12. So those multiple years of cuts resulted in necessary cuts to enrollment and staffing levels at that time. Now, a funding plan by Governor Brown began in 2013-14 and included about a 3 to 4% general fund increase each year over a multi-year period. And the two funding plans proposed by Governor Newsom in his first two January budgets continued this period of growth until COVID-19 dramatically changed those plans last spring when the university was cut by $299 million. But as Chancellor Castro just mentioned, there's some good news on the horizon. So I've been talking about budgetary trends up to this point, and now we'll shift to spending trends. So this chart will show our core expenses per full-time equivalent student as compared to the University of California in our comparison institutions that we've used for tuition and fee comparison over the last 15 years. Now, IPEDS is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. It's collected annually by the U.S. Department of Education, and this data creates a common set of statistics for higher education comparisons and reporting. Now, IPEDS data is a little dated, but based on past trends, we would not expect much of a change in the trend line for this last fiscal year. So core expenses are reported from IPEDS and include such items as instruction, academic support, student services, institutional support, and scholarships. They do not include items like research or auxiliary enterprises. So this first line is the University of California, but we've excluded University of California, San Francisco, because it is a professional medical school and does not have traditional undergraduate or graduate programs. Now the orange line is our comparison institutions average, 13 of them selected by the California Post-Secondary Education Commission many years ago. And this green line here is the average of the CSU's 23 campuses. That's 63% lower than the University of California and 34% lower than our comparison institutions for total spending per full-time equivalent student. This demonstrates our continued efficiency over the years. One portion of the core expenses shown on the last slide is administration or administrative expenses. So to isolate administration expenses for CSU, UC, and our comparison institutions, we again used IPEDS data, specifically the category known as institutional support. This includes items such as general administrative services, legal, fiscal, operations, human resources, and information technology. Again, the first line here is the average per full-time equivalent student for the University of California, excluding the San Francisco campus. This second line is the average of our comparison institutions. And finally, the green line is the average of all 23 CSU campuses. Again, demonstrating our relatively low cost per full-time equivalent student for administration. I'll now move away from looking at total spending to looking at funding per degree. This green line is the total general fund as adjusted for inflation divided by total degrees awarded in that year. And now the blue line is total budget per degree at the CSU. This shows that the CSU has been finding efficiencies over the years, increasing total graduates while working with fewer dollars per degree. However, this is not a sustainable trend and one that could begin to call into question quality over time. Now on the Z-axis on the right-hand side of the slide, we show the total, we show the trend in total degrees awarded. A very steady increase over time, reflecting ongoing commitments by the board and our campuses to increase graduation rates. Now this ends Steve and my portion of this presentation. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Blanchard and Nathan Evans.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ryan and Steve. A critical component of the CSU's mission of access and opportunity is the university's ability to support all Californians, regardless of background, in achieving their educational goals. To that end, CSU continues to offer one of the most affordable undergraduate educational programs in the nation. As Ryan noted earlier, as part of this commitment, approximately 11% of the CSU's annual expenses from the operating budget are supporting students through the State University Grant, our CSU Institutional Aid Program. But SUG, as it is often called, is only one element of a much larger student financial aid program. I will now turn to Nathan Evans, Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for Academic and Student Affairs, to walk us through a few elements of student financial aid, which directly connects to the information you have heard from our colleagues in business and finance this afternoon. Nathan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Blanchard. Financial aid plays a tremendous role in ensuring that students are able to afford a CSU education. And the magnitude of the CSU's need-based financial aid program is unparalleled among other four-year universities. In 2019-20 college year, over 390,000 CSU students received financial aid. And while financial aid packaging is based upon a student's total cost of attendance, the defining expense of being a student is tuition. A striking fact, 59% of all CSU undergraduates have the full cost of tuition covered by grants, scholarships, or waived. That is financial aid that does not need to be repaid. This is not coincidental in any way. As you'll hear in a moment, the CSU prioritizes grants, scholarships, and work-study employment when creating financial aid packages for students. On average, 70% of the financial aid dollars awarded to CSU undergraduates is non-loan financial aid, with the remaining 30% in loans. Many other universities in the nation would have the inverse ratio of financial aid. As a result of this grants and scholarships first approach, more than half of CSU students completing their bachelor's degree do so with zero student debt from their time at the CSU. And for those students who do take out loans for their CSU education, the average loan debt is just over $18,000. In today's presentation, our goal is to provide a brief, high-level overview of the different types of financial aid available in the context of the earlier discussion of tuition, fees, and CSU budget. On this slide are some of the more common grant, scholarship, and loan programs that are available to CSU students. To access federal, state, or institutional financial aid, a student completes either the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, or a California DREAM application to initiate the financial aid process each year. As I mentioned, the CSU awards grant aid first, unlike many other universities which may prioritize loans or some other self-help component in their financial aid packaging. This best supports CSU students by reducing unnecessary borrowing, particularly given our significant population of first-generation, low-income, and historically underserved students. I'll quickly walk through the typical approach to developing a financial aid package for a student. First included are grants, included the ones listed here on the screen. Federal Pell Grants are particularly notable since in addition to tuition, they can help address the cost of housing, food, and other expenses. This typically occurs when tuition is already covered by another award. More than half of CSU undergraduate students receive a Pell Grant. Other significant grant programs include the state's Cal Grant and the CSU State University Grant, both of which are primarily designated for tuition, meaning they apply to a student's tuition each term. To connect to the earlier comments by Ryan Storm, when 11% of the CSU's operating budget is spent on financial aid, it's primarily for State University Grant, otherwise known as SUG. Next in the packaging process for eligible students would come middle-class scholarships. This state scholarship is only available to a student if 40% of their system-wide tuition is not already covered by other grants or tuition waivers. After the middle-class scholarship would come work-study funds. These are federal funds that are very limited, and it's important to differentiate work study, which is awarded through the financial aid process, from general on-campus student employment opportunities, which are more abundant, but not part of a student's financial aid award. And finally, if a student still has unmet financial need, their package will include the option of federal loans or DREAM loans. It's also important to note that should a student or family face a significant change in their financial circumstance, campuses can reevaluate the student's eligibility to determine if they may qualify for additional assistance. This has been particularly important during the pandemic and resulting impacts on employment across the state. Finally, we wanted to highlight the magnitude of the major grant programs, federal Pell Grants, state Cal Grants, and institutional state university grants for undergraduates. What you see on screen are the relative dollar figures for each of these grant programs for the last 3 fiscal years. Again, this only reflects those awards to undergraduate students. Pell Grants, shown here in the navy bars, provide the greatest amount of grant funding to the CSU, a little more than $1 billion annually. That's followed by the state's Cal Grant program in gray, which is about $800 million last year, and our institutional state university grant in light blue, which equated to about $600 million for undergraduates. Now, if we added in other postgraduate and graduate students, that would figure for SUG would go up to about $700 million. Again, what's important to keep in mind is that both the state's Cal Grant and the institutional state university grant are primarily tuition designated grant dollars, whereas in the CSU's context, Pell Grants would primarily be available to cover non-tuition expenses, such as housing, food, or campus-based fees like those discussed earlier. In the materials that were shared in advance of today's retreat were a more detailed overview of the elements of cost of attendance, the determination of financial need, and several demographic breakdowns of the CSU student population. We hope those materials provide beneficial references not only for today's discussion, but also in the future as well. And with that, I'll now turn the presentation back to Steve Relier for his summary comments. Steve?
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Dr. Blanchard and Ryan. So just this is the final slide and just some takeaways. First, as you can see, allocations from the state of California, tuition and fees are all related and very important components of our funding and providing resources for the mission of the university. The health of the state budget, clearly, as you've seen from those charts that Ryan showed, that health has been a key driver in determining what CSU funding has been over the years. And clearly, the California State University is one of the nation's best values for our students. And this is not just borne out by the data that you've seen, but from national magazines and journals and papers who call Cal State University the best bang for our buck. CSU produces high quality degrees and a great educational experience and is clearly a key driver in the social mobility of our students. And finally, the university's robust financial aid program is unparalleled among four-year universities in the country. So that's our overview, and at this stage, we're happy to address questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions or comments? That was a lot of material. Thank you. Really? No questions or comments?
Sai has his hand up.
Oh, all right, Sai.
Me too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sai and Jack. All right.
Don't know if it's an appropriate question to ask now, but you listed out the expenses per FTE. Can I assume those are the expenses? If you total all the expenses, that's how our campuses are budgeted? How are our campuses budgeted? Is it per FTE expenses?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. Why don't I'll start, Ryan, and then you can fill in any blanks. When we get a budget, and of course, as you saw from these charts, the budget amount is going to differ pretty dramatically each year. In fact, just look at the current year that we're in, where we were cut over $300 million, and what's likely to be our allocation for the upcoming fiscal year, just very, very different years. And what we do is we take the information that we have early in the budget process, and we sit down with the 23 presidents, and we go through a process of determining, given the resources that are available, what are the right factors to guide the allocation to the campuses. So oftentimes, as you mentioned, Trustee Abrego, dollars per FTES is a factor, but it's not the only factor. For example, as you saw, tuition is a big component of the university's operating budget. And our campuses have very different levels of tuition coming in because the demographics of the students at our campuses are very different. Another factor that we have used is Pell eligibility. For example, to the extent a student has a very large number of Pell students compared to another campus is an indicator of the needs of those students versus those other campuses. Another factor that we've used in allocating resources is the size of the campus. So, we have smaller campuses like Channel Islands and Monterey Bay that in some respects are just barely at the critical mass in terms of the administrative infrastructure and student services infrastructure to serve that campus, as opposed to, say, a large campus like Fullerton or Northridge or Long Beach. So what we'll do is we'll sit down with the 23 presidents. We'll go through all of these different factors. We'll look at a lot of different options for allocating whatever is the allocation for that year, if in fact there is an allocation, because some years there isn't. But if there is, we'll run through that with the presidents, and we'll have a very robust set of meetings going through a lot of different options and weighting these factors. And in the end, fortunately, every year we've come to a consensus among all the presidents on the best methodology to use to allocate those resources.
Thank you. It's much more complicated than I thought. I thought you would just take the annual care expenses, the annual administrative expenses, and the annual care expenses, put the total together, and that's how each campus gets funded. Thank you. I'll meet with you separately to get more detail information.
Yes, please. Please do. I'm always happy to talk about these budget allocation methodologies because we do spend a lot of time on it. And as you can see from the information that Ryan provided, we don't have a lot of money to work with to start with. I mean, as you can see, we're doing this at a much, much smaller amount of funds, almost based, regardless of the ratio that you used. These campuses run very, very tight ships. So we have to get it right. And we have to do a lot of consultation with the presidents to make sure we do it right.
Thank you.
Hey, Trustee Keynes, did you have a question?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So I see Romy and then Doug.
I have a question regarding the category 2 fees, the campus-based category 2 fees. Ryan Storm reported that across our 23 campuses, we have over 100 of these kind of fees. But on the average, if you can give me an idea, how many new fees, new category 2 fees are instituted on an annual basis on our campuses? I assume that number is relatively small. We have 23 campuses, and I would assume, and I hope that this is a single-digit number. But can I maybe get some information how many we had last? Well, this year doesn't, because of COVID, there were probably not many new fees. But in the previous years, I assume there were very few new category 2 fees instituted by campuses. but how many that would be would shed a little bit of light on how much work it really would be for the Board of Trustees to review and to approve them.
I don't know the number, Ryan. Would you know the number?
Yeah, yes, I have a good ballpark off the top of my head. Steve, what I'll do is I'll have you kick off any sort of responses, and then I'll be the color commentator at the end there. So we don't talk over each other. How about?
Sounds good.
But Trustee Sebelius, a few years ago, we put together some information on the number of fees to figure out how many of these new Category 2 fees there were. And I believe off the top of my head, there were 5 of them in the last 5 years that were created. For the most part, Category 2 fees have been around for many, many decades. So for example, you have student union fees, or you have a health services fee that's applicable to all students on a particular campus. What you do have, though, however, are a number of adjustments that can occur from whether it makes sense to grow those fees by an inflationary factor, which type of inflationary factor. Is a particular fee, has it been static for the last decade, and are the growth in costs for that particular program just starting to get dwarfed because there's not enough revenue to support them? So those are always in play. Right now, under the current fee policy, you have presidents who have that authority to manage those funds and adjust them through that consultation and the referendum process. But it's not just, I wouldn't go so far to say you would only be reviewing maybe one of these per year. If you were to take the entire bag of adjustments for all those 145 fees, there's a lot of moving parts on those in any given year.
Okay, Doug, and then Jack, you had a question. I guess your raised hand function's not working? No. Okay, so Doug and then Jack, please.
Thanks, Lily. I have a few questions. On Romi's comments just now, I'm curious about how many of those new fees were success fees, and how you defined, I can't even remember how success fees were defined as opposed to some of these other fees. And I was glad to see that you were pointing out that referendum on these success fees, at least, are binding and not just input. And whether there's been one of the little remembered things about the success fee policy and law is that left untouched were existing success fees at the time, but it was part of that policy and law that after 6 years, students could have initiated a referendum to eliminate even those success fees. And I don't know if people remember that on campuses, but that certainly is there. It'd be interesting, if you have any follow-up information to Romy, if you could CC me on it, or anybody else that's interested, I'd certainly be interested. The other question I had is, I hadn't realized that Pell Grants are able to be used for things that are non-tuition, and that actually sounds great. And in the context of what we're hearing about food insecurity and housing difficulties and all those, could you talk a little bit about how Pell Grants are helping those concerns for the students, and what kind of success you're having in being able to alleviate some of those problems, and how many of those problems continue to exist, and what we can do about it?
Thank you, Trustee Fagan. I'm going to ask Ryan to address student success fees, and then I'll ask Nathan and Dr. Blanchard to address the Pell Grant question.
Sure. So for a little brief history on student success fees, there are 12 of them on our campuses. They were established between 2008 and 2014. The last one was adopted in May of 2014. Those fees have essentially only changed due to a inflationary price index that was established when those fees were established. Any sort of escalation. I recall that the one that was at the Dominguez Hills campus had a long-term horizon implementation phase. Generally speaking, you're correct, Trustee Fagan, that as of January 1st of this year, students could petition the campus to have those fees repealed. But I will say that if there are any student success fees created in the future, which haven't seen any since 2014, any proposals to do so. But in the future, if a fee were to be created, there also is in statute that when the fee is created, that there needs to be kind of a 6-year hands-off sort of phase where the fee is in place for 6 years, and then afterward, there can be a determination by students to potentially repeal those elements of those fees that are not dedicated to long-term commitments, like long-term commitments. And generally speaking, in terms of how those student success fees were defined, it was defined by the great work that Trustee Fagan and other folks have worked on during that phase in the 2013 to 2014 timeframe, where there was a really in-depth look at student success fees, the processes that established them. And because of that great work, we not only have incorporated the work of that work group into the CSU fee policy, but also the state legislature thought that it was such good policy that they put it into state law as well. So I think we have a pretty good structure on those student success fees at the moment, where students do have that opportunity, like you said, to be part of that discussion about whether they continue or not.
And I'd be happy to touch on the Pell question that you had. In the materials that we sent in advance, there was, for example, a breakdown of how what's encompassed in an individual student's estimated family contribution. And there are variations, there are budgets if students are living at home, on campus or off campus. And among the elements that are part of that, in addition to tuition and fees, are the cost of room and board, books and supplies, transportation, and other personal expenses. So in that packaging, to the point you made, Trustee Fagan, as Pell is awarded, it can certainly fulfill some and cover some of those costs as students' aid is packaged. I think one of the challenges and that we see, and is certainly in our federal advocacy strategy, is a need to increase Pell for a variety of reasons. Pell has been fairly static for a number of years, with the exception of some additional Pell eligibility that was afforded that, for example, allowed students to use Pell for summer enrollment. It has been fairly unchanged for a number of years, but we do see some traction beginning to take hold in Washington, that there's more interest in raising the annual Pell Award and also potentially expanding it. For example, students that are undocumented or DACA students today are ineligible for Pell, but there are certainly at least discussions happening about expanding and increasing that. Another sort of policy issue in California, which could impact the access to Pell for our students, was embedded in the governor's January budget. And that was a policy recommendation that all high school seniors complete either the FAFSA or the California DREAM application as part of high school graduation requirements. Now, there are a number of other states in the US that have that as a policy directive for the state, and that is intended to broaden access to those aid programs. And so California certainly leaves money on the table at the federal level by not having as many students complete the FAFSA or in California's context, the California DREAM application. So I think there are a number of moving parts that will potentially provide more access to Pell for our students. And that's the type of resource, to your broader question about applying that to basic needs issues, food and housing security and other student costs, the total cost of attendance, it could make a big difference.
Okay, Jack?
Yeah, I just think in terms of our reporting on tuition and room and board, we always seem to be very focused on tuition and how much support we're providing to the students. I'd like to see a similar type of emphasis on room and board and how much of that is being covered by various programs, because that cost is more than double tuition and has a tremendous effect on the student population. What is the source of the State University Grant Fund program? What's its funding source?
Ryan?
Essentially, it's general fund and tuition revenue. It's all the revenue sources that support the operating fund.
And how do we determine how much goes into that program?
The way it has been structured in per the fee policy is that whenever tuition increases, that 1/3 of that tuition revenue needs to be set aside for that program. So it has grown to a grand total of $701 million. What you saw with Nathan Evans' slide was a $600 million figure. That was for strictly only undergraduate students, but in grand total, it's $701 million for the entire program. And it's expense like anything else, like expense on a salary or a benefit or a utility cost.
That's appropriated each year and spent the full amount each year?
It is spent each year to the maximum, and it is appropriated to it is allocated to each campus each year. I will note, and maybe I'm wading into Nathan's and Dr. Blanchard's area too far, but we do share this a lot. But what we do in the allocations each year is we are also gauging where that student need changes each and every year. You know, it's not a static situation where a certain number of students are of particular financial need forever. Student demographics change, and so do the population. So what we do every year is we have our finger on the pulse of what a campus's proportionate share of financial need is for the SUG program. And so what we do every year is we reallocate about 5% of the funding for SUG to move money from some campuses to others that have growing SUG need. Because you wouldn't want to have a situation where there's a campus that has a significant amount of SUG eligibility and need, and you aren't able to support that financial assistance, while another campus may have too much money. So we incrementally, on a very small basis, move money from one campus to the other, from a group of campuses to the others each year, just to keep pace with where the demographics lie.
Can it be used to support financial aid for room and board?
It can be used for tuition, and per the campus, the campuses have the authority to apply up. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking very clearly. So the SUG program covers tuition. It also can be used for half of the campus's Category 2 mandatory fees. That latter part is determined by the campus president, whether they want to extend that SUG to cover those campus mandatory fees. But for a long stretch of time, probably good 10 years, the program was limited only to tuition assistance.
Okay. On out-of-state tuition, I keep on banging this one, unfortunately for some, I guess. But I still am interested in that, and I would hate to wait till the 2023 report from President Armstrong. Is there a chance that we could, this is just an ask, it has to be considered by the board. I'd like to see an interim report at the end of this in May or June as to what's actually transpired there, because I know there are a number, this is one of those areas where one size does not fit all. I know some campus presidents have told me they don't want to see an increase in out-of-state tuition because it could negatively affect their enrollment. There are other campuses, I know San Diego State, I think San Jose State, probably Pomona, are three that would like to see an increase, and they don't think it would affect their enrollment numbers. And so I just like to see the report from President Armstrong and then take a look at, as a board, what the alternatives would be at that point. And then finally, with respect to size question, I know there is some friction on some of the campuses, and I know it goes back historically, and it happened with me when I was with San Diego State, there was always some negative feeling about the way the funds are being allocated because of the social equity issue. With Pell, some campuses get more, considerably more, and others get less. And I think Elliot Hirschman chaired a group that looked at this formula a few years ago and made some changes in it. But I think at least in the finance committee, I'd like to see those numbers again, just to make sure we have a comfort level that people are being treated fairly. And then last, with respect to Romy's issue, I'm one of those guys. I mean, I don't like to fix something that we don't think is broken. And there's always a fine line in the system between centralized governance and decentralized to the campuses. And I know that it's at San Diego State, they approved a success fee in 2014. The students basically taxed themselves to hire 60 more full-time professors. And if that's what the students want to do and they go through a good democratic process, I'm all for decentralization and letting the campuses within reason do a good job with this. And I think Doug was involved in it. Everybody spent a lot of time on this issue a few years ago, and I'm very comfortable with where this thing is right now. And I don't see a lot of abuses, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. That's it.
Okay, Larry, Peter, and then Doug again.
Madam Chair, I have my hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not seeing hands today, Crystal. I don't see your hand there. All right, so were you next, Crystal? I don't know. I'm sorry. I haven't seen
I'm not sure. It's been up for a while. Maybe it lowered.
Can we hear from Crystal first? Sure. And then Larry, please.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. So to give some more perspective, I know we're talking about Pell right now. I currently am a Pell student, and this last year, fall 2020 and spring 2021, I was given Pell for about $3,000. I got Cal Grant B, which was only $800, but my fees were about $3,000. So Pell, my entire Pell went to fees. And I had about $900 for room and board. And so it does create a challenge, especially when you're working a campus job and you're kept 20 hours a week. And so there's also that to consider, because room and board isn't just $900. So just to give some perspective on that. I did have a question for the presenters. I had some questions on alternative consultation for fees. Can you explain a little bit more about the methods of exactly what alternative consultation campuses have used? Any specific examples?
Ryan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Lots of different ways. First, obviously, email blasts and text messages. That's one way. There have been a number of campuses that have established a number of information forums at different times and locations. So it would be 8 o'clock on this part of campus, midday at this part of campus, and in the evening. So what the practice has been is to try to cross-sectionalize and grab students where they might be attending. If you have evening-focused students, allowing them the opportunity while they're on the campus to do that. Also on different days of the week. Another thing that's been a real savvy way, I keep recalling a Fullerton approach, which was as students enter the online portal and do work, as they do a lot, they were splashed with a notice that, hey, we wanted to give you a heads up that we're considering a particular fee change. And there was an option to learn more or no thanks for now. And that campus splashed that for every student 3 times. And they couldn't go on with their business without them having to click out of that box and get away from that. So that's another technological way of doing it. Obviously, one of the things that I think I've heard from a number of campuses that have used consultation versus referendum is that you actually get that feedback that is really helpful in terms of helping guide what the president ultimately goes forward with. So you don't just have a yes or no because, well, gee, we really didn't want it to hit that certain dollar figure versus a smaller dollar figure, and you wouldn't know that answer through a referendum. You actually hear that back from students about, well, we think the fee's too high, or I wouldn't use that service, or you get that constant feedback from students and faculty as well, and staff in that process. So there's a number of different ways of doing it. I'm probably not giving it as much service as I could because I haven't run through one of these on my campus, on a campus, but those are just some of the examples that come to mind right now.
Would you say most of the alternative consultations are survey-based for students?
Yes, I would say so. And if we're talking about survey, not necessarily on a piece of paper, but more of a interaction, right? Or an opportunity to interact. I think there's also been ways in which you can, where campuses have actually issued a survey, like what are the different ways of doing surveys online? But you know what I mean, where you fill in the bubbles and the blanks, that kind of thing. So that's probably the most used process, is more of an interactive feedback. Add your comments. Please give us some context as to why you believe a certain way. And it has resulted in changes. It has resulted in changes.
For both the referendum and alternative consultation, do you happen to have like a number on the top of your head to like a percentage of how many people from the campus community have responded?
I don't have that off the top of my head. I do know, though, from the referendum process, which is measurable, oftentimes referendums have about single digit to maybe up to 12% student population involvement in those. And so that's one of the detriments, is that if you're not interested in voting on that particular day or involved in some way, you might just miss the whole opportunity to be involved, versus the other route, which is where, the president or campus leadership may be in your area of the campus, and you may be able to sit in on a particular meeting.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Larry, and then Peter.
Thank you. I have just a couple things. Ryan, the charts that you put up that were the comparison charts between the CSU, UC, and comparable institutions, I may have just missed those, but did those get distributed to us as the trustees?
They did not. We only provided them here via the broadcast.
Yeah, unless there's some reason that you want to keep them internalized, I would love to get a copy of those. I think they're very telling, particularly with our alumni, frankly, to talk about the value of what they've received. So if that's possible, I'd like to ask that you share that presentation out to us, please.
Yeah, we'll be sending that out to all the trustees.
Great, thank you. Second, although I think you already touched somewhat on it. When I looked at financial aid packaging, et cetera, one of the areas that I constantly get feedback from high school students and even parents when I'm talking to them about the CSU, et cetera, is the lack of understanding of what is available to them in the form of aid when considering going to college. I get constantly them saying, well, I don't know that we can afford to send our child or our children to the university. How much outreach do we contemplate, or do we do, or should we do at the high school level, both of their counseling crew, the staffs, as well as information available to their parents that we proactively provide?
I'd be happy to start, and if Dr. Blanchard or others have some other information to share, they can jump in. Having actually been a former admissions director on one of our campuses, I would say this is at the root of every conversation we have, beginning in middle school outreach through high school. It's a combination of preparation academically, social, socio-emotionally, but also financially for college. And so not only outreach that we do from our campuses directly with our K-12 or PK-12 partners and community college partners, but also with community-based organizations. We also do this significantly in collaboration with our partners in the UC, community colleges, and independent colleges, and with the California Student Aid Commission. The Student Aid Commission has an additional program called CalSOAP, which is the California Student Outreach and Access Program that most of our campuses are affiliated with regionally through consortia. We run, during sort of financial aid season, which is longer these days than it used to be, and sort of giving more opportunity. There are all types of different, financial aid Saturdays, kickoff Saturdays. Many of our campuses opened their doors in pre-pandemic times to computer labs for FAFSA. And so this is very much embedded in our outreach and recruitment work. And then to your point, Trustee Adamson, we host each fall upwards of 6,000 to 8,000 high school and community college counselors through counselor conferences. This has been done now virtually for the past couple years, but in the past, those were physically mounted throughout the state, and we embedded in those also significant information about financial aid. What I would also say, because I think you bring up a good point, is the financial aid process, as it's structured in this country and state, and as it is within our institutions, is somewhat complex, and moving through the federal level have been some steps to try to simplify the FAFSA, for example. We've tried to use some clearer or more salient messages in the CSU. For example, on average, families earning $70,000 or less will have tuition covered in the CSU. Now, I know that doesn't go beyond immediately to the other costs of attendance, and we're very supportive and engaged with CSAC and our partners about talking more holistically about the cost of attendance, but we're always looking for those sort of more salient, clear messages like, if your family income is $70,000 or less, you will have tuition covered in the CSU, something that's really comprehensible to any student or family member.
Thank you. I just think that's important for us to stay very focused on the proactive side of that, so that we're not losing students because of their families' misunderstanding or lack of understanding of what they might be able to tap when it comes to helping them with their children's education. Lastly, Nathan, we sent out some pie charts that you sent that came yesterday. One of them is the undergraduate demographics, fall 2020. And I found it very interesting. This is kind of sensitive, but I want to raise the issue. We profess that we are the people's university, that we represent the state of California and demographically what it looks like, and that's what we target and attempt to do. And this is kind of a reverse argument, so I want to be careful the way I couch it. But so I looked at these numbers closely, and then I compared them to the population of California. And what I found, we all can look, is that we are at this point, we are, and rightfully so, heavily skewed to Latino students at 46%, and there's 39% of our population. The others are fairly close. We're a little underrepresented in Black. It's at 4%. The population is 6% in California. The others are fairly close. And then I look at white. White makes up 37% of California's population and 21% of our student body. And I just want to make sure that we're careful, that we keep an eye on making sure that we try to keep the balance as we can to represent the people of California, and that the unforeseen consequence of really our very heavy focus, and continued rightfully so, on those that are we're trying to serve in upward mobility, that we don't create a system, a university system in California that doesn't represent the entire state population as well. So I hope that we always are looking at trying to keep as proportionate, because I don't want to end up with a university system in California that actually it becomes somewhat segregated, that there's certain demographics go here and all the others go somewhere else. And I know this is sensitive, and I'm not sure I put it in prep, but I just want to make sure that we're always keeping an eye that we represent this people of the state of California and we stay the people's university.
Could I just jump in for a second? I'm Larry. I'm wondering, I'm not a demographer, but is that how you say it? I'm just wondering, though, I would imagine that probably the Latino population would skew younger. So perhaps if we're looking at college students and students in general, right, it may not be more, not more heavily weighted. It's more heavily weighted because of the younger population, which is skewing more Latino. I don't know if maybe Joe could speak to that or somebody else.
And you may be absolutely right. I didn't do a dive down. I just looked at overall population.
No, I understand. Yeah.
What I don't want is, quote unquote, a white flight out of our universities either. We want our student bodies to represent what will ultimately be workforce and everything else out there. That's all.
Okay. Joe, I just am throwing that out because that just seems to me that would be the case.
Yeah, the demographics are different for this age group. So Nathan, I don't know if you have that at the top of your head, but if you don't, we can share a document with the board after.
I don't have it off the top of my head, Chancellor Castro. I appreciate the vote of confidence, but I don't have that at my fingertips. But I think to your point, also looking and sharing the population in our public K-12 schools may also be informative of the shifts we're seeing in our students of traditional age as well. So I'd be happy to share that following the meeting.
Okay.
I want to just quickly add here that part of this as well is looking at how iPads have begun to redefine race ethnicity, and that there's a new category that a lot of our students are selecting, and that's multiracial. And so it's recognizing, and I'm not saying that all of the white students are selecting that, but I know that we have seen a shift even in the number of African-American students and in Latinx students that are honoring the fact that they are coming from multiple racial groups. And so as a result of that, they are checking off multiracial as opposed to white or Black or pure Latinx.
Oh, okay, so now I'm seeing hands waving and hands up. So I think Peter was next, and then Jack. I don't know how long you were waving your hand, and then I see Cy there, but Cy, I think you're going to go. I'm putting you at the end of the group. So let's go with Peter, Jack, Doug, Jean, Chris, Mariana, and then Cy. If you could remember the order I called you in.
Appreciate Chancellor Castro and Provost Blanchard, your follow-up and explanation. I've spent a big chunk of my career trying to figure out how to help African Americans be successful in post-secondary education, and I've watched those numbers fall consistently over all the systems, and very often it's simply because higher education is set up to serve 18 to 24-year-olds, very not great at always serving the adult learner or the single mother or the recently released incarcerated person. And although progress is made in those areas, I think as we expand the type of student that CSU serves, you might see some of those numbers, Trustee Adamson, better reflect some of the percentages you rattled off. Two things. One, I wanted to endorse Trustee McGrory's comments about supporting and endorsing and backstopping student referenda. We may not always agree with how they vote, but a fair, fun, above board, democratic process ought to be supported by us. Students don't always make decisions we would make, but hey, that's part of the learning and growing process. Ryan, my question has, we have a lot of good information about comparing our tuition to other universities, and that's great. But on the student housing side, I would also love to see some comparative information as well. We know housing, again, can be 2 to 4 times more expensive than our tuition costs, depending on where in the state a student attends. How are our on-campus housing costs versus other institutions? I've always had the impression they're pretty similar, but are they? And maybe, are there opportunities for us to address cost issues on the housing side that maybe heretofore we've been so focused on tuition, rightfully so, and maybe we might be able to shift resources or find additional resources in that space. So I'd love some comparative information on the housing vis-a-vis, similar to what we see for tuition. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all my points and comments.
Peter, this is Latifa. I know I've been sort of quiet in the back, and just to double end off of you, and I'm curious, because on-campus fees are so high, and some of us have, recent college students who have dealt with this inside of the state, I'm finding that, a lot of young people end up going into the private market, right? And so how many, I don't know, it might be impossible to find that data, but to understand who's living off campus, on campus. Some folks are living with family, but surely if your dorm fees are $1,400 a month, you can get a room for half of that in many of the campus cities. So I appreciate you lifting that up. But my understanding is that from the campuses I've visited, I think that the on-campus ranges from $900 to $1,400 a month for a dorm room, which is typically shared. Is that correct?
Ryan, I don't know if you have those figures. Unfortunately, I don't have them, and I know they vary quite a bit from campus to campus.
Okay.
But we will provide a recap on housing costs.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think Jack, you were next.
I think real quickly, I was going to respond to Larry's comments. I think you really have to look at the demographics in California for the under 25 population, which is significantly different than us old people. It's just a completely different demographic swing occurred in the last 20 years, and it just makes those numbers look very different. And then on housing, I just think, again, we really ought to focus on housing costs and board costs, and I want to make sure our P3s aren't driving the costs up more, that we've got control over these housing costs, and that there are programs to help people who can't afford the housing to get financial assistance.
Can I just make one quick statement, and that is that on the housing side, I just want us all to be clear that we have about 17% of our students across the CSU that live on campus.
I just wanted to say that we have to look at the demographics or the pipeline that's coming in. Already over 50% of the K student populations are Latino. So 12 years from now or 13 years from now, there'll be freshmen in the CSU. So we should compare not only the CSU trends, but the UC trends as well. I understand that this year they have one of the most diverse groups of incoming freshmen ever. And we should also compare it to the CC. So we can see the demographic changes among all 3 higher education institutions. And then finally, going back to the fee committee, at Fullerton, we used to have a student fee committee comprised of faculty members, ASI student leaders, student club organization presidents, students at large, staff, and they reviewed all the proposals for fees. And then they would analyze them all. And if they came to an agreement of 1 or 2 of them, then they would take it to the president and decide whether it be a referendum or a consultation process. If it was a consultation process, it would go back to the fee committee, and then we would decide whether to include the ASI officers, the athletics department, certain classrooms, and we would decide the cohorts of groups that we would share the proposal with, and then come back to the president and give him or her our recommendation. So there's one step in the campus process that's a student fee committee, which has wide representation on it. So it's not just a president isolated making the decision.
Okay, Doug and then Jean.
I wanted to get back to one thing that Jack had mentioned earlier. I think he was referring to a student referendum at San Diego State that seemed to express support for the student success fee. And that specific campus, and this goes back a number of years, obviously, was a good example that we discussed in the success fee process, because while it was publicly stated that it was the students' referendum supporting it, what a lot of people didn't realize was that not all students were eligible to vote. The only way you could vote is if you attended and could show it one of the administration's seminars on campus showing why you should vote for it. There were no opposing seminars. So in fact, that's why, if I recall correctly, one of the items in the success fee policy and law is that all students have to be eligible for it. And that specific campus and experience is what really raised that question. And in fact, there were some other campuses, I don't want to limit it to only one, that had not similar situations, but the appearance of referendum for students that when you drilled down into weren't really, those weren't really happening. And I have to agree with Peter, you know, consultation is great, it's input, but the ultimate person making the decision is not the students. So while the referendum may be low in turnout, equaling some or surpassing some low turnout elections in the general public, it's still a referendum of the students who choose to do that. And personally, I find that much more democratic. But the real thing I wanted to ask, and to get back to food insecurity and housing, is there somebody who very briefly could just tell us, I remember being told that something like up to 10% of our students are facing some of these challenges with the Pell Grants and other their benefits. Are we chipping away at those numbers? Are people still having those problems at those levels, or are we seeing some kind of light at the end of the tunnel for that? I'm not sure who could answer that.
I can certainly begin, and if Dr. Blanchard has more to add, you know, I do think that yes, and as we saw in the governor's January budget, there's still a strong commitment by the state to continue to address this. I would also sort of describe it as chipping away. It is a systemic issue that our students, challenges that our students face, that certainly many segments of our state's population experience the same challenges. I think we've seen incremental amounts of dollars come in. Our campuses are working closely with their community-based partners, with counties and organizations to sort of build a network of support, and through some of the financial aid changes that we talked about earlier, as well as others that are on the table. I think there's a movement in that direction. We have had a sort of three-part research endeavor with faculty on our campuses, engaging with students. Be happy to share sort of the most recent data on that, but I would still couch it as incremental, that these have been sort of addressing the symptoms of a greater challenge, which is sort of supporting the full cost of attendance for students, as well as our broader challenges in the state that we're also looking to help be a part of the solution for.
I'll just quickly add that certainly when you consider the effects of the pandemic, the effects of job loss, that all of that factors in and is impacting our student population. So it's very difficult for us to be able to say concretely that all of the efforts that we have underway, that it's making a significant impact. We know that it is impacting, but then you have other factors that are at play as well that we're having to continue to monitor. That's why we're also, and I'll just quickly say that we're partnering more and more with local agencies, certainly around mental health, certainly around food distribution, and that it's all of that is not just being borne by our campuses, but understanding the collective responsibility we have in partnership with our local and state agencies to give the support to our students.
One thing I did want to mention was how President Castro at Fresno State was, I think, one of the initiators of food banks and helping people. So we were always very impressed with that. And most of the other campuses have started that as well. So we know there's a real concern and a real effort, but hopefully we can be even more aggressive on that. Thank you.
Okay, Jean, and then Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I think it's a really, really important conversation, and I would appreciate getting a copy of all of the slides that were not in the packet. Yesterday, when we got these three incredible examples of CSU as 100 students, I was trying to understand what we should read from this. And I didn't know if you were going to cover it today. But as Larry said, it shows us here that 17% of our students live on campus. So, we always have to remember we're a non-residential system, basically. And then when we go to the chart that's in the packet of what the real cost is to go to the CSU, I mean, it's overwhelming. It's really overwhelming. So I would welcome another conversation about this, just focusing on that and what we need to do to help our students, because I think this is really the heart of the issue, isn't it? How can they afford to go to the CSU when these costs are so high? And yet we are by far the best system in the United States, by far, and the value is so extraordinary.
Okay, Mariana, and then Diego.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for that presentation. I feel like we haven't necessarily had a conversation like this in a while, and it's just been really helpful to see where everyone is. I just want to start by kind of addressing some of the comments that Doug and Peter made. I think an example of kind of an alternative consultation that I've been through was really not too long ago, and it was a process where there was some sort of a survey. If you attended kind of a presentation that was made about, why this particular fee is needed, you would basically get you'd have to bubble kind of three choices. One of the first choice was obviously saying no, and the other three were just variations of it actually passing. And at the end, when the counting took place, it kind of, the probability of you getting a no was obviously less because all the different versions of yeses were put into one basket. So it's definitely a process that I honestly myself am still trying to understand. So there are definitely areas that we have to cover or at least kind of try to understand. And I think when it comes to referendums in general, just from experience, it's sometimes very difficult to kind of get a lot of students to vote. And it's really a lot of work to do marketing and to educate. But I think essentially at the end of the day, the biggest message that, I've tried to get across and a lot of students have tried to get across is that we are not, and most likely the folks that are actually voting won't necessarily be paying that fee. It's the folks after us, and it's considering, where they are and where we all are essentially. So that's kind of the first comment. The second comment was something about, it's kind of related to what Larry said. And I think something that I've recently been having conversations with students who identify as SWANA. So they identify as part of the Southwest Asia and North Africa. So we're basically talking about Middle Eastern folks and folks from North Africa, Egypt, et cetera. So historically, those students have actually been classified as white, and federally that's the case as well. So sometimes, and I actually myself, when I apply to the CSU system, I basically had two choices. I would either put as white, which is how we're federally reported, or I would put as other. And I usually preferred others because I didn't necessarily feel like me putting white kind of aligned with my background and my culture. And so just kind of something to put out there is that part of that percentage, and even looking at the other, like the section that says other, who are those students? And I feel like just kind of just remembering that is very important, especially when it comes to the percentage of the white students we have, and understanding that it kind of includes other folks other than, folks who solely identify as white. Now, I kind of have two other questions. I was looking at the chart that Jean just showed you all, and I was looking for, information about student parents. I haven't necessarily seen much data on student parents, and I was just wondering if we have anything on that. So that's kind of my first question. And my second question is there some sort of data being collected about how the pandemic has impacted, whether it's students, faculty, staff? Are we going to see something, in the near or far future? I know that's a lot of questions. I'm so sorry, but I've just been taking notes down and trying to get a full understanding. Wow, did I ask a hard question?
No, we're just trying to figure out who was going to answer it. So
I appreciate
I'll ask Nathan. I'll ask Nathan to speak to the parents piece. But certainly, in terms of the effects of the pandemic, we know that a number of our campuses are doing that kind of aggregate work now, and it's campus by campus. And we have been in regular conversations, obviously, not only with our presidents, but also with our provosts and our VPs of student affairs, and a lot of the information, and our students. And a lot of the information is more anecdotal in nature. And so we are thinking about a way that we can not only collate that information and collect it perhaps in a more formalized way, but also really trying to help to better understand who the CSU will be post-pandemic, and that realizing that who we are now or who we were in 2019 likely will not be the case once we get beyond the pandemic. And so it's a roundabout way of saying that we are going to be collecting more information about the impacts of the pandemic, but then also looking at how we can use that information to better understand who we might be beyond the pandemic. Nathan, can you help out with the parent question?
I can, but let me first acknowledge, Trustee Kames, you referenced also the topic regarding SWANA identities. And as you know, a number of student leaders have been engaged with our colleagues in institutional research about adding that to the application. But to your point, so while we collected, and we think that's very important, and we're moving forward in that direction so that students can see themselves in the options, we also at the end of the line have to report within a federal framework. So we're balancing that, but I think it's a very valid point. I appreciate your leadership and other students that have brought that as a topic, and we are moving forward with those changes. On the student parent piece, at the point of application, there is not today a universal question about whether students themselves are parents. That information comes largely through the financial aid process. So it would only be those students who are submitting either the FAFSA or the DREAM application, which is more than 80% of our students are filling out one of those two financial aid applications that we have that data for. I don't have it on my fingertips, and you're at my fingertips, and you're right, it wasn't on the CSU was 100 students, but we'd be happy to get some breakdown data to you and the other trustees on that.
Thank you.
You're muted, Lily.
Diego, and then Chris have questions.
Thank you to everyone who put this together. It's incredibly helpful. Both the budget overview and the Graduate Initiative 2025 progress report, I found both really helpful to look at. And specifically around the Graduation Initiative 2025, just thanks to the tireless work of folks on campuses. I have one comment I'd like to make and one question I'd love to ask. The comment is relative to our conversation this morning. This has been so fruitful, and I hope we continue to do more deep dives of this sort, as I've just found this really helpful from a governance standpoint and as a newer member to learn. So thank you. The question I have is, there are so many amazing things happening on each of the campuses about how they are using some of their budget dollars towards student success. I kept writing down, wow, great idea. I like flagged 7 different pages in the report. So there are 2 questions. One, are there any examples where we're taking something that started as a graduation 2025 initiative on a single campus and actually rolling it across all 23 campuses? And then the second is, if not, in what ways are we proactively sharing these, incentivizing these, and trying to get some of these best practices that are increasing graduation, that are increasing equity, and sharing them more broadly across?
Thank you so much for your question. The reality is that the answer is yes, that we absolutely learn about some of the strategies that are being implemented campus by campus, and it's making a major impact on that campus. And we use that through the channels that we have. Each campus has its own graduation initiative work group. It's called different things on campuses. As a matter of fact, one is called GIG, the Graduation Initiative Group. And what we do is make sure that those individuals, especially the leaders of each one of those, get a chance to talk to one another on a regular basis. And so one example that I can share with you is the supplemental instruction, which is a peer-based coaching and mentoring program where students are in classrooms, and that was working very successfully at least 2 of our campuses. And now at a system level, we have worked it out where we're able to scale it across our 23 campuses, just as one example. But also bear in mind that every year, well, annually, we've been hosting the Student Success Symposium, or the Graduation Initiative Symposium. And that is also a great way that we showcase what's really working on campuses, and we showcase that which we have scaled. And we also look more nationally as well at other efforts underway that really is of value to us. The last thing I'll say is that every year we produce a report that really aggregates all of the different areas of focus on our campuses that's designed to improve student success. It's required by the state legislature that we produce that report and submit it, but we also make sure that our board members get a copy of it. I can't tell you how rich in information that report is annually, and how proud we should stand to see all of the tremendous work that's happening on our campuses relative to moving significantly moving both the student success needle and the equity needle.
Okay, so our final question, because this day flew by, it's almost 2:00. So I'm going to take the final question from Chris, and then we will wrap it up.
Thank you, Chair Campbell. And I just have a comment and a suggestion. So first of all, thank you to everybody who put this day together. It's been unbelievably fruitful, and I'm so impressed, as always, with the great work of our staffs. A suggestion I have for the Chancellor and the team is USC has a group called College and Career, a core of college and career advisors. And as a superintendent of Long Beach, I hired these people for over a decade. We had 16 of them. And they actually worked in our high schools because the CSU does a great job of outreach. But these individuals were recent grads with their BA or BS who were going on to get their master's, who then helped our kids do the FAFSA, do all the applications. And I can't tell you how important this was, because once we implemented this core of people, our scholarships jumped to over 100 million annually a year. And we were sending about 75% of our kids on to college, and about 70% of them, because we track all of them through the data, were finishing in 6 years. And I think the power of the CSU to do this as a system would be unbelievable to support our GI 2025. So just a suggestion, and I can work with people to tell you how I know districts would pay for it, which we did. So thank you.
Great idea, Chris. So, boy, this was incredible. It was better than I hoped. I want to thank all the presenters. And for you new trustees, I know that it can be overwhelming, the information. And as many of the older trustees have said, I've been on the board now almost 7 years, and I've heard a lot of this information over and over again, but that's what it takes to keep hearing about it, learning bits here and there. And, you're always learning. That's the wonderful thing about being on this board. It really is like getting a PhD in education. So thank you all again. And thank you to my colleagues, you other trustees, for your wonderful and insightful questions. And remember, we will be doing deeper dives. So please let me know, or let the chancellor, the vice chancellors know what you're interested in, and they can kind of, see the responses they're getting and go start with the ones that we have the most questions and need for. So with that, I just want to thank you and turn it over to our chancellor.
Thank you, Chair Kimbell. Well, I want to again thank all of you for participating today. I still remember the day in the fall when Chair Kimbell called me and said, I have an idea. I think we need to have a retreat. And I think it's turned out extraordinarily well. And I just want to thank you for your leadership, Lily, and Wenda and Roberta as well, and Michelle for all of her great staff work, and everybody who participated in developing the materials. I will work with Chair Kimbell and Vice Chair Fong to assemble these deep dives, and we'll do it in a way that's going to work for all of you and will be manageable for our team as well. And I'm excited about that. I think it'll make it better for everybody, and will make the CSU stronger. So I won't continue to talk. I know we're almost at 2 o'clock. I'll hand it back to you, Chair Kimbell. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. So this concludes the Board of Trustees Leadership Retreat. The board will convene for our next regularly scheduled meeting on March 23rd and 24th, 2021. Notice of the meeting will go out in the ordinary due course 10 days in advance of the meeting. Thank you all, and take care of yourselves. Bye.
The Office of the Chancellor's